We are live, Magali.
All right. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another conference day at the IBCI. This is a very special panel, special to my heart, because the two groups that I am part of, both the IBCI and CREATE, have joined forces in this panel. So all my colleagues here are with me in the CREATE Center in University of Glasgow. We have Martin and Philip, Xiaoren and Aline, and you will see when you're watching on YouTube their descriptions below. I'm really excited. We're going to be talking about transparency and innovation in regulation, both in terms of substance more generally and in terms of matters of process. So we'll start today with Martin as a speaker who will give us a little introduction. So Martin, you can share your screen and start speaking.
Well, thank you, Magali, and good morning, everybody. It's very nice to be able to have a conversation with my colleagues before an audience which is for us in the creative economy context quite unusual. But I think it is really important to understand really what we are watching at the moment as part of what I call a new wave of platform regulation. So there's a global shift, a new paradigm, and that not only affects competition, it affects data and privacy, it affects communication structures, it affects media, it affects intellectual property law. What we are trying to do today is looking a little bit at connections and seeing whether in our field of law there are aspects relating to transparency that may matter to innovation in the wider competition sense. So I'm an intellectual property lawyer, and we have been looking at the area of platform regulation through the lens of intermediary liability and the concept of the safe harbor. This is a norm that emerged in the US and sometimes has been called the 26 words that created internet. This offered a shelter for internet service providers for the liability that may have arisen for content that is posted to their service. So famously, that's Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and a specific version for copyright law has been enacted in the US in 1998 and has since been exported globally. It has been exported in law. The EU norms are very similar. But they have also been exported in practice through the terms of service of, for example, Google. So Google, regardless of the jurisdiction in which they operate, they will have a notice and takedown procedure which follows the US legislation, regardless of whether you have a safe harbor in a local jurisdiction. With my colleague Chris Eriksson, we've done a review of the evidence. So what do we know about the effects of the regime that was established in the late 1990s? Having a system of notice and takedown, once you receive a notice as a service provider, you become liable unless you act within a short time frame. So that system, we examined what do we know about the operation of the system, and it's not easy to do because the content moderation practices of the online platforms are typically not shared. We'll come back to this. And what we found from the evidence from transparency reports by some of the platforms, also from experimental kind of studies which post content and see what happened, and through a range of other methods, are that there was a dramatic change in the number of notices in the late noughties. So rather than right holders filing individually for takedown, there were automatic processes from databases of content which are owned, and they were then processed at large scale to the service providers. And the evidence also shows that the enforcement system, the reaction by the platforms for taking content down, struggles with taking account of, for example, copyright exceptions. They can't assess, whether a music video is a parody within an exception in a particular law. They will recognize that it uses a work which is protected under copyright law, but it cannot make this assessment whether it's an infringement or not. And we also find that there is an underuse of what is called counter notification, so where users challenge content moderation decisions. And generally, the large platforms are in a much better position here to have processes that ensure compliance. Google Content ID is the most advanced system we know about for identification of content, but Facebook's algorithms for content moderation, we will return to those, operate on a similar scale. So that was the evidence for the first 15 years of operation of the notice and takedown system in the particular field of copyright law. So if you look beyond copyright law, the first statutory intervention of this new wave of internet regulation is the German NetzDG from 2017. So this was the first law which removed the safe harbor in some ways. So for a list of criminal offenses, social networks with more than 2 million users had to remove unlawful content within 24 hours upon notification and keep it down. So this stay down aspect changes the nature of liability dramatically, because it requires future monitoring, which under the previous shelter was not necessary. And also the law has a reporting requirement. So the platforms within scope have to file every year, every half a year, a transparency report. How many requests for takedowns they have received, and on which grounds, and takedowns that then took place as a result of these notices. So that was for the first time we could open in some ways the black box on decision making by online platforms, and this is just a little first look here at these reports. Facebook did report very little. They hit the notification which was required under the new law, and they were fined in 2019 and changed their practices after that. So here are a few graphs from The Economist, which are based on transparency reports by the three of the big networks, Facebook, Twitter, and Google. And they reflect practice by the end of last year. And if we look at Facebook here, what is very interesting is that the most of the content moderation decisions are happening by Facebook themselves, based on their own detection algorithms. So the takedown is not initiated by the user. The takedown is initiated within the company, and it's based on the terms of service, the community guidelines of the platform itself. And that's very important, because there are several reasons for that. One, Facebook doesn't want to have local policies for each country. And it is a much less costly way of enforcing. I mean, Facebook employs 35,000 moderators now, so it's certainly not cheap. But the human review is a secondary aspect. It's not the main regulatory mechanism employed by the platform. And if you look at the graph on the right about Twitter, there we can see that there are many more complaints received, demands for takedown in law than are acted upon. So the freedom of expression assessment that is required here is quite considerable. So this is, we come now to the government dimension. So these are requests filed by governments to Google for content removal. And they are, much less than the overall content moderation decisions. Unsurprisingly, still considerable. So in the copyright field, there have been 5 billion takedown enactments since Google started reporting. 5 billion. So copyright is by far the biggest takedown aspect of all content as a reason for removal. But if you look just at the government requests, they're under the 30,000 per year. But they're still quite a number. So the issue of what the role of the state and national sovereignty considerations, security considerations are in what we see on online platforms is obvious. Okay, so we have a rough empirical picture how the world operates at the moment, already in one could say in anticipation of this new wave. So we started with a safe harbor where platforms had a liability shield. We are moving to a world where there are in competition law you call ex ante, essentially where there are obligations on platforms to act anticipating harm. So they have to act before actual harm occurred. And this trend we see in the major interventions, and you will have discussed during the conference already, that in the EU, the big ones, the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, which are mirrored in some ways in the UK through the interventions under the Digital Markets Unit, competition law, and the Online Safety Bill, which is currently before a joint committee in the House of Commons and House of Lords in the UK Parliament, receives a lot of attention, and they have a category of high risk, high reach services, which will be designated by the regulator and stamped by the Secretary of State, which then have a range of obligations, which also will include reporting requirements. So potentially we will know much more about what is happening inside the decision-making processes of platforms which are designated in these new strategic categories. The regulatory intervention then will be based, and that's a very interesting approach, which is in some ways typical to the UK, on codes of conduct or codes of practice. So these have a weak statutory basis. There's a lot of debate how they will be applied and enforced. So codes of conduct are behavioral obligations based on particularly designated firms. And the nature in competition law relates more to interoperability and sharing of data in the case of content moderation. In our field, they relate to anticipating harm and how, for example, algorithms that feed content, let's say, about slimming products or about political misinformation to particular vulnerable individuals, for example, would be already potentially within scope here. Okay, so last slide. So I try to give the big picture. You know, we have a new wave of platform regulation that affects many areas of law. The competition law sits not alone. IP law doesn't sit alone. Content moderation, media communications law doesn't sit alone. Data protection law doesn't sit alone. Underlying this all is what I call here a paradox. So the states are trying to assert their regulatory power. And the question of state sovereignty is very high on the you know, in the rhetoric in the UK post Brexit, and I'm sure Philip will come back to that. But what in effect appears to be happening is that we delegating traditionally state powers to these platforms. So these platforms in some ways become more powerful by taking on roles of policing and enforcing. And the title of which groups our various talks together this morning, you know, we thought we would think about transparency, and transparency in one sense seemed to be innovation enhancing, in that it removes information asymmetries, and we find out to a greater extent what happens inside the black box of the online platforms. But the greater transparency also comes with a risk of much higher monitoring. So the obligation to prevent harm also raises the bar of what the platform needs to know about their users. You may say they know that anyway, and they need to have this knowledge in order to operate their data-based business models. That may be true or not, but that's certainly a very interesting question. Is, you know, lifting the black box and seeing what is happening in content moderation decisions within a platform, whether this knowledge is innovation enhancing or not. So that's one of the challenges I would like to put to the audience. And I conclude with the regulator mechanisms of codes of conduct and codes of practice. So these behavioral remedies or anticipations which have a weak statutory basis and can be changed quite quickly. So in one sense, they are flexible regulatory tools that can take account of, you know, emerging of new platforms that target minors, you know, more quickly than having a new law. On the other hand, there is they also much closer to the executive of a state, and harder to challenge. There is basically in the regulatory system, as it is emerging, at a tension between being very close to the executive on the one hand, on the other hand, having a goal of increasing innovation, and whether these two goals are in tension or not is a question I also would like to pose. Thank you very much.
Martin, I think that brings us to Aline, who will talk about algorithmic transparency, which has clear links, I think, with what Martin just said. So, Aline, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm also going to share my screen, if it's okay. Just a minute. Well, actually, my presentation today is has some relation with my PhD thesis, which deal with copyright governance by algorithms and how we can achieve a more transparent regime. But since we don't have much time, and also not at the beginning of my research, I'm going to talk today more about the rules and standards on copyright and algorithmic transparency, what we already have today. The idea is that it's a paper that I'm working on at the moment, and it's to assess the usefulness and the limitations of the current transparency regime within copyright and within platform governance to address the necessity of further regulation. So in this aspect, first, just to contextualize, I think everybody knows that nowadays internet has primarily become algorithmically driven. Algorithms influence what we watch, what we read, what we buy. So we have like social media platforms and these video audio streaming platforms who use algorithms to recommend and to suggest what movie, what music we should listen to. We also have these e-commerce firms who use online platforms to commercialize their products. And these online platforms, they also use algorithms to actually display, to define how they will display the products for us in their platforms. So all of that has consequences, of course. And from a copyright perspective, usually it influences how we visualize the content and how this content is monetized. So for example, in the UK, the UK Parliament, they release a public consultation, and also there is also now an DIP office discussing the economics of music streaming. And one of the complaints of musicians, for example, was about the opacity of algorithm creations and the necessity of greater of oversight of these algorithms, because they said that it influenced, for example, how they are remunerated, because algorithms impact directly if people will listen to or not their music. And also from a competition law perspective, there are some studies from the Competition Markets Authority here in the UK where they talk about how some platforms are using, and there are some concerns about unfair ranking systems, design choices, where platforms uses their algorithms to obtain some kind of commercial advantage. In this case, we have the Google Shopping case, which is quite famous for competition lawyers, where the European Commission considered that Google was infringing copyright laws for displaying their services in a more favorable way comparing to some of their competitors. And in this case, usually there are a lot of concerns in terms of insufficient trust and insufficient transparency in the use of these algorithms. And many scholars, regulators, and all stakeholders who deal with this platform environment, they have proposed transparency as the main remedy. And when we talk about transparency, usually involve some kind of, well, some of the preconditions is information asymmetry and power imbalance, which is quite clear when we talk about online platforms. And the thing is transparency, and then I use Xiaoren concept about transparency, because he separated transparency into different kinds of transparency, which would be social transparency and public transparency. Because in some ways, and we have seen with online platforms, sometimes they just adopt some self-regulatory mechanisms because they have been pressured by the society to be more transparent in the use of their algorithms. So they have adopted some transparency mechanisms voluntarily. And in this case, for example, we had in relation to online platforms, we had, for example, data grants. Twitter, for example, they made available, I think in 2015, some options for researchers request data for research purpose. We also had some advertisement archives with political purpose, which also it's something that Twitter, Google, and also Facebook created. And also we have the social science one, which was also actually a project created by Facebook after the Facebook after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which they kind of created a group where they would collaborate with researchers to be more transparency in the use of their systems. And recently we had the TikTok announcing their Transparency and Accountability Center for Moderation Data Practices. So this is just a few examples of transparency practice which are not mandated by the government. It's like mechanisms that were adopted voluntarily by platforms. But in all these cases, there was some criticism by civil society. For example, Algorithms Watch wrote a report saying that most of these initiatives, they are incomplete, they're ineffective, they're unmethodological, and they are unreliable. And that's where Etzioni say that transparency is quite important, but usually it's not an alternative to regulation. Usually, actually, when you talk about transparency, you are talking about a live form of regulation, because you usually need some kind of regulation to guarantee that information, not only that information is disclosed, but also that the information that are disclosed by these companies, like these private companies, are understandable. The information are real, there is veracity of the information, and they should be enforceable. So you should be able to require that platforms disclose this kind of information, companies in general. So one of the case we have is nowadays, as Professor Martin mentioned, the transparency reports, which became mandatory. If we know before they were not mandatory, actually, I think, if I'm not wrong, they started as something that platforms adopted voluntarily, but then it also, after some time, most legislations, most new regulations that deal with platforms, they start adopting and making this kind of reports mandatory. And, let's see. So in terms of algorithmic transparency, what would be that? It would be the idea of we should be able to understand how and why the algorithms arrived in a particular decision. So the rationale behind its decision making, and some of the information that have been requested are the description of the algorithms, the purpose of the algorithms, the data sets that were used to train, for example, especially when we talk about AI algorithms, how they were trained, the risk is involved in the use of these algorithms. But when we talk about algorithm transparency, there are also some challenges, because when we talk about more advanced AI technologies, such as deep learning AI, there are black boxes. So sometimes it's not so easy to explain how an algorithm arrived to some kind of decision. Also, software in that data, they are proprietary. So some data are also protected by privacy rules. So not all kinds of data can be disclosed. And also the code of the algorithm sometimes cannot be disclosed either, because there are trade secret involved or other, or even copyright. And also, for example, TikTok, they defend that there should be some kind of disclosure about how their algorithms work, but they say that they should be to a specific group, because there is always the risk also of unwanted manipulation of the algorithms if you give all the information. So in terms of legislations, we already have, from a copyright perspective, we already have actually transparency rules is something common, especially for when we talk about collective management organizations, given their monopoly and oligopoly characteristic. Usually they are over-regulated and they have to follow many transparency rules. And this is in almost every country who adopt this kind of system. I actually brought the directive, the EU Directive, which is more recently about collective management organization, and their some of the license agreements that they have to deal now with online music. And we can see that they adopt information disclosure obligations for CMOs, and they adopt this to different kinds of actors. So for example, there's some kind of information that they have to release for right holders, some kind of information that they release to other CMOs, to online service providers, users, and public. And I think this is quite interesting because it's a similar approach that have been defended by some civil society groups and some also some scholars for algorithm transparency. They say that you should probably adopt, for example, full disclosure to regulatory bodies, some mind disclosure to researchers, and some other kinds of disclosure for the public in general, considering the level of confidentiality of the information you have to disclose regarding the algorithms. We also have, in copyright legislations, we also have the Copyright Digital Single Market Directive, which brought some transparency rules in relation to license and transference agreement. In this case, they wanted to allow authors and performers to have information about the exploitation of the works they already licensed or transferred to another part. And this is the case because they had a lot of problem to access information when you had an agreement, for example, between record companies and platforms, since these are usually non-disclosure agreements, and platforms and these record companies used to say that they could not give this kind of information about how their works were being exploited, the revenues, and now actually the new directive brought this new, like their right to be informed about this. But we also, about algorithms, we still have new laws. For example, in copyright law, we already have a proposal. Actually, it was not adopted yet. It's actually being discussed as a code of conduct now, but in Australia, about news publishers' rights and how they should be able to have access not only to the audience data, but also to change up in the algorithms ranking from the online services providers, because this is something they have influence, of course, directly in their interest. And also the Royal Decree Law from Spain, which transposed the Copyright Digital Single Market Directive in Spain. They also brought the same obligation about online platforms provide information about the main parameters determining content ranking and the relative importance for news company. So what we can see is that we already have some kind of algorithm transparency provisions in copyright law. Also, we have, I know that I probably don't have much time, so we already have also transparency rules in data protection and privacy. When we talk about the General Data Protection Regulation, we have AI strategy. For example, the German National AI Strategy brings transparency as one of the main principles. And we also have in platform regulations. And one of the cases is the EU Directive on better enforcement and modernization of EU consumer protection, which will come into force in May of 2022, and also bring transparency requirements with regards to the main parameters determining ranking and the relative importance. So what I brought here just to compare, and I'm finishing, we have like the EU Online Platform Regulation, which is for business to business, and we have the EU Digital Services Act proposal. Both of them bring transparency as one of their main concerns. And in this case, for example, from EU Online Platform Regulation, there is transparency requirements from online platforms and search engines, which will have to disclose their main parameters used to rank goods and services on their site. And when we talk about main parameters, they make clear that it could be any general criteria, process, specific signals incorporated to algorithms, or other adjustment or the motion mechanism used in connection with the ranking. They say that among this information, they would also include explanation of any possibility for business users to actively influence the ranking against remuneration. The Commission should be responsible to provide guidelines to inform how these ranking systems, how these transparency requirements involving ranking systems should be followed by online platforms. And From the other perspective, we have the Digital Services Act proposal, which have like three main goals. And one of the main goals is to establish a powerful transparency and clear accountability framework for online platforms. They bring different layers of obligation on transparency report, especially about content moderation activities, which include the use of automated tools. There are transparency about advertisement, and for very large online platforms, since they divide the platforms in different categories, they also include the necessity of perform assessment risks, which include how recommender systems influence, for example, the manipulation of their services. And they should also undergo to independent audits and allow access to data, especially for digital services coordinator and commission, the European Commission, or even to some researchers. And also in terms of algorithmic transparency, which is, I think it's the most important part, in one of their articles, they bring the obligation of the developers, so the very large online platforms, to disclose the main parameters used to rank goods and services on their site, as well any options for the users to modify the parameters, including at least one option which is not based on profiling. And finally, and just to conclude, I think what is important about all of that, it's a lot of legislations, and it's that what we see is that transparency has been considered by many, especially here in the EU. We have been seeing a lot of this discussion. It's an important way to guarantee increased accountability, especially for powerful actors such as online platform. But it's necessary to take into account the context, the adaptive ongoing changes of an area that you have such a, it's always changing and very fast, and to ensure that citizens can access and understand the relevant data. So usually to guarantee that you achieve all this purpose with transparency, you should require, it requires some kind of state regulation at the outset, and that's what has been discussed. There are already, we can see there are already some legal rules that are approved or are still under discussion as the Digital Services Act on algorithm transparency, including copyright legislation. And this rule usually focus on the main parameters used to rank goods and services on online platforms and search engines. Usually what we can see also is that mandatory transparency report has become common in platform regulations, but we are not sure if they will be the solutions. So we will see that we have seen that other transparency requirements have been imposed, and one of those are, as the Digital Services Act proposes, the performance of assessment risks, independent audits, and also to give access to data to some regulators or some different kinds of groups. So what we have to see is whether, my idea actually to conclude is whether the regulatory regime, the transparency regulatory regime we have today are enough to deal with the problems we have and the concerns we have in terms of copyright, or whether we will need to think in new forms of regulations. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Aline. I think we'll move on to Xiaoren and talk about the YouTube recommender system. I think that's what Xiaoren is going to talk to us about. So I don't know if you want to share your screen or if you're going without slides. Surprise us. You are still muted.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, and we can see your screen.
Okay. A little bit slow. Sorry. Sorry, my computer is dying. Okay. Well, thank you for having me here. Today I'm going to talk about the anti-creative factors on YouTube. Some of my colleagues might have already known this research. So there are some video sharing platforms such as YouTube, TikTok, often promote themselves as the supporters for the creators. For example, the TikTok, they claim that their mission is to inspire creativity. YouTube said they will build YouTube for creators. And Vimeo said that we have all you need to make great videos. All these advertisements promote image illusion that the video sharing platform might provide a creative paradise. And this illusion further raised a concern that if the government or the legislators impose more regulations or the legal liabilities against those video sharing platforms, they might chill the user creativity on the platforms. However, whether this illusion is correct, whether the creative paradise is a misunderstanding or the wrong presumption of those video sharing platforms. So this research will explore this question. Are those video sharing platforms are really our creative paradise? The project will explore the economic theories on culture goods and also psychological theories on creativity. I try to summarize those anti-creative factors and from those existing economic and psychological studies and evaluate whether there are the anti-creative factors existing on YouTube. And further, the project might test some of the identified anti-creative factors on YouTube. So the first question is, what is creativity? It usually includes two dimensions. First is novelty. It means that whether the product or the idea is different, is new compared with existing products. And the second dimension is usefulness, whether the product is useful to address the real problem. The research will focus on the first, novelty. So now let's look at some anti-creative factors in the psychological studies. These studies indicate that the lack of professional knowledge or skills of the creators might restrict the availability of creativity. And second, some explicit external motivations such as money rewards or attention or explicit evaluation might chill the creativity. This might be caused when people feel like they are manipulated by external factors, they might feel less likely to create. And also psychological traits. Some psychological traits such as the intolerance to vagueness or uncertainty might reduce the likelihood of creativity because it's always like that creativity needs to explore the new area and there's uncertainty in the new area. So the intolerance to uncertainty might restrict the liability of the creativity. And also there are some environmental factors which might chill the creativity, such as short-term limits. It will impose a lot of pressure to the creators, too many evaluations, over negative or over positive feedback, low income or funding, intolerant atmosphere, social factors. And also in the economic field, studies also show some anti-creative factors. I will pick some of them to elaborate. For example, the uncertainty of culture goods. When a cultural product, such as a book or a movie, is launched in the market, no one knows whether it will sold well in the market. So this will induce creators to mimic the previous successful ideas or products. And this will lead to the homogeneity of the culture products. The gatekeeper effect. There are some gatekeepers, such as movie theaters, galleries. They decide which cultural products to promote in the market. And sometimes they filter out some creative works with low commercial values. And also, overprotection in copyright might also choose creativity. So now let's look at those, let's try to evaluate whether the YouTube has these are some of these anti-creative factors. First, in psychology field, some studies indicate that there's a lack of professional knowledge or the skills, because a majority of the YouTube creators are amateurs. So this respect might reduce the level of creativity on YouTube. And second, there are external motivations. YouTube try to encourage creators to pursue the attention, to pursue the number of the subscriptions so that they can get more sharing of the advertisement fees. So these external motivations might encourage most of the YouTube creators to pursue the attention instead of the creativity. And the environmental factors, there are also some factors on YouTube which might choose creativity. For example, studies show that the majority of the YouTube creators has no income from directly from YouTube, because 86% of those YouTube creators has no incomes from YouTube according to the threshold of sharing advertisement fee decided by the YouTube. And there is insufficient time for creators to make videos, because to keep the attention, they have to upload the videos frequently, like once a week. And third, there are substantial percent of the comments and each videos are over negative comments, which might also chill the creativity. In the economic field, again, creator poverty is a big problem for creativity. And uncertainty also exists on YouTube, because before a video is uploaded to the YouTube platform, no one knows whether it will go viral. So creators try to mimic those previous viral videos, and this leads to the homogeneity of most videos. Another factor related to uncertainty is anti-trendization. Some studies show that 32% of the YouTube videos are belonging to the anti-trendization and popular culture. This is because the creators pursue the attention so that they might create some videos similar to previous popular ones. And also, there are inequality between creators. The top 3% of YouTube creators catch 90% of the views, the attentions. This is unfair to those new creators, but however, those creative videos are likely to made by those new creators. But this inequality of the attention is in favor of the new creators. Behind these factors, the YouTube recommendation algorithm is amplifying those factors, those anti-creative factors. For example, the YouTube recommendation algorithm promotes the video according to the past search and history, which means those popular, those contents, those videos similar to previous popular videos contents will get more promotions of relying on this YouTube AI stand. And besides these factors, copyright protection system on YouTube will also have the chilling effect on creativity. YouTube develop content ID auto filter to automatically report and flag, remove those videos containing copyrighted materials. However, some studies already show that there are over-targeting problems on these copyright auto filter. So this will further chill the creativity of the videos. If we summarize all those anti-creative factors, we might find that they all point to one direction, homogeneity of the videos. So the next step might explore whether YouTube videos become more and more similar. The potential strategy is to download the transcript of YouTube videos and plot those transcripts, analyze the word overlapping and also similarity in the meaning. For example, let's imagine if we download a lot of video transcripts and we plot them in a graph. The bubble size represents the overlapping degree, and the distance between the bubbles represents the difference in the meaning of the words. So if the transcript of those videos has high diversity, we might expect that there are large number of bubbles, and the bubbles are small because there are small overlapping, and also the distance are large because the meaning of the words are different. On the opposite side, if the transcript has the low diversity, which means high homogeneity, we would expect there are a small number of bubbles, and the bubbles are large because there are a lot of overlapping, and also the distance are small. So this measurement can be used to measure the video homogeneity on the video. So we can test whether the homogeneity is a trend on the YouTube videos by yearly to explore this data, and also whether the homogeneity is different according to different categories of videos, such as education or entertainment. And also we can explore the homogeneity, the relation between the homogeneity and the creator status. So I will stop here, and I'm open to further conversations. Thank you.
I know I've heard about this research before, but now I'm fascinated all over again, though I actually already knew you were going to do this. So that's always a good sign, right? So the next person up is Philip. And Philip is not one of those boring lawyers like we are. So he might actually tell you something new and more interesting. So Philip, your stage is yours.
Well, boring or not, I'm a sociologist of culture and media with a particular interest in how those relate to politics and policy. And thank you for the invitation to speak. It's very good to make this connection. And I'd like to focus on the UK and what I now judge to be the phase of neo-regulation of digital platforms that we've entered. So if Martin's identified a new wave, I think there are sort of new factors within the new wave that we need to pay attention to. There are two contextual factors that we need to take into account. One of them is geopolitical, the UK leaving the EU. This is otherwise known as Brexit. And we should understand this as a process that faces many obstacles and not as a completed act. And the second aspect is the present process of innovation in the organisation of regulatory bodies and their intersecting competencies. Well, platform regulatory innovation in the UK has particular conditions of existence, but I do think that what we're witnessing here has broader implications and more general applicability. A good starting point is to ask what kind of regulatory system a state permits, and I think actually what's the way this contributes to the discussion is a way to pose the question that's already been posed in a slightly different form. So what forms of regulation are invented, encouraged, or allowed to emerge? And as everyone knows, regulatory politics are highly dependent on the state form, so the national dimension still has preponderant weight, and so does the political regime's positioning on the spectrum of democratic openness and authoritarian closure. And within the state form, we need to consider the available repertoire of forms of regulation that is underpinned by the political and legal cultures, and that is always highly specific. In 2020, the UK entered a consolidating phase in developing platform regulation. Aside from being shaped by Brexit, and we must note the creation of a voluntary collaborative forum by a diverse group of regulators. And this has been a response both to Brexit and also to the challenge of platform power. The Digital Regulators Cooperation Forum is modelled on established UK competition regulation. As a model, it also draws inspiration from colleges used in international banking regulation. And in addition, it is founded on a pro-competition approach, which is taken as axiomatic. By early 2020, the key elements of a reframed British regulatory field were in place. By summer 2021, with the digital economy as its principal focus, it was fully established. The British approach has specific national characteristics, but it's also part of an international regulatory turn. Different states are acting diversely to the impact of major platform power, and we've already had illustrations of this. The UK has two key rallying points. First, online harms, which encompasses mainly social and political issues, and second, a pro-competition approach, which is focused on the malfunctioning of the market, consumer interests, and on engendering innovation. In March 2021, the UK government published its, and I use the term in quotes, its vision of a global Britain. This view of changing geopolitics and geoeconomics sees the UK as a national security state facing serious adversaries. To deal with the world requires what has been termed, and here again to quote, a whole of society approach to resilience. In the UK today, where we face supply chain shortages, with our National Health Service on its knees, and the army supplementing the civil power during the recent fuel emergency, as well as keeping the ambulance service going, we may think the story of resilience to be rather fanciful. But on the contrary, I think we should take global British ideology seriously because, in fact, it is reshaping the field of platform regulation and other fields besides. The UK's defence of critical national infrastructure is very high on the agenda. For instance, Huawei's technology is regarded as a threat to national security. Another more proactive British aspiration is to pursue regulatory diplomacy, and I quote, to influence the rules, norms and standards governing technology and the digital economy. Today, the official vision of a global British UK casts the state as a unique European country with global interests, which is intent on redefining its role. Regulatory reform, which is one of the consequences, now means repositioning and re-equipping selected regulators with new instruments, dispositifs. The innovatory response in platform regulation has reorganized agencies' firepower into an open-ended expert consortium. This is intended to mobilize a complex, state-sanctioned epistemic community. Regulators, at least, know that taking on the multifold task of platform regulation means using a wide range of skills and reducing the frictions of boundaries established by statutes. Such intensive and extensive interagency networking, whether within a state, among a group of states, or globally, is certainly not unique to digital platform regulation. This model is currently used in British financial regulation, which has been an important reference point. I've tracked the process of recent regulatory reform in an article presently under review, so this is the first outing of the argument. It's clear that reform has depended on top-level political belief in the efficacy of reform. But I do believe that the regulators themselves have played the major role in defining their ideal conditions. It's not an accident that the rethinking of regulatory competencies has coincided closely with the UK's geopolitical repositioning, just as it was preparing to exit from the European Union. When Martin Kretschmer, Ulla Furgau and I first scoped the regulatory field, 3 UK regulators, the Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA, the Office of Communications, Ofcom, and the Information Commissioner's Office, ICO, were clearly going to dominate the next phase of platform regulation, and these are indeed now the key players. The future shape of platform regulation was influentially set out in 2019 by a government-commissioned review led by Jason Furman, a former Obama administration advisor and Harvard economist. This advocated a pro-competition policy focused on consumer benefit with, and I quote, a clear set of rules to limit competitive actions by the most significant digital platforms, while also reducing structural barriers that currently hinder effective competition. And again, the key illustrations of those significant digital platforms have already been discussed and how this is shaping up legislatively. The key recommendation was to set up a well-resourced digital markets unit, the DMU, with an ex-ante approach to pro-competition regulation, as Martin has usefully defined it, anticipating harms. This new body would be linked to the Competition and Markets Authority, to Ofcom, the Media and Communications Regulator, and to the Information Commissioner's Office. And so we knew a while back that another player was destined to join the crowded British regulatory field. And if you think it's not crowded, you want to kind of take a look at our earlier work. You'll see just how crowded it is. What then ensued, which illustrates how UK regulatory politics works, was a series of reports, each of which largely reiterated the case made by the Firma review panel. So you won't find anything terribly new if you read your way through all this stuff, which I have been doing myself. The British reform process drew on practices available in the political culture. A key one was the creation of colleges of regulators with concurrent powers. The UK government next endorsed the idea of, and I quote, a new pro-competition regime as a key part of its forthcoming digital strategy, and this would set out its overarching approach to regulating digital technology. I think the regulators then took the next key step. As I've noted, they created something new called the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum. This was organizational innovation by press release. In other words, this is not a secret, but it's also not widely discussed outside circles of tech lobbyists and consultants who make money out of tracking developments and advising firms on strategies. And then there is the occasional academic who takes notice and asks, well, what is going on? The regulators have argued that their newly minted collaboration and the new Digital Markets Unit need to be put on a statutory footing. They say the UK should retain first mover advantage in, I quote, championing a modern pro-competition, pro-innovation regime. So of course, this soft power strategy is itself a global competition doctrine. By 2021, the Regulators Forum was arguing increasingly forcefully for the need to develop a legislative framework that embeds cooperation in the digital regulatory landscape. So there's a way in which the regulators themselves can see much more clearly than anyone else the need for cooperation to deal with an increasingly complex range of platform powers. As we review the last couple of years, it's clear that a pro-competition agenda has come to dominate the process of regulatory reforms. However, in the foreground, official and public attention has focused far more on online harms. This is now the province of Ofcom, the best known of the key regulatory ensemble because of its oversight of media and telecommunications, which are always in the news. Ofcom's agenda-setting discussion paper in 2018, addressing harmful online content, laid claim to an expanded remit that would include digital platform regulation. Its compendium included activities harmful to children, spreading terrorist content, incitement to violence, and misinformation. In December 2020, the UK government appointed Ofcom as the online harms regulator. But it also stressed, and it's useful sometimes to see what ministers actually say, that, I quote, "the development of the online harms regime represents an important step in the UK's strategy to create a coherent and pro-innovation framework for the governance of digital technologies and to set the global standard." In other words, the pro-competition dimension, I think, gives a certain skew to the online harms aspect. In May this year, the draft Online Safety Bill was published, and the post-Brexit UK is no longer required to legislate in line with the EU's e-commerce directive. The UK's policy is beginning to diverge more and more clearly from the EU. Here are two straws in the wind. First, Ofcom, the communications regulator, has called for evidence for its review of net neutrality and has indicated a likely shift from the EU's open internet regulation. This call has been given the pro-competition rationale of supporting innovation and investment in the digital space. Second, the UK's post-Brexit global data plans now include asking the Information Commissioner's Office to encourage, quote, "the responsible use of data to achieve economic and social goals, as well as preventing privacy breaches." It remains to be seen how the UK government's data trade plans will impact on platform regulation. To conclude, although regulatory activism is occurring on a global scale in various regimes, in the UK, Brexit has provided a geopolitical framework for the process I've just discussed. Its architects in the UK government are pursuing their vision of a sovereign national security state. Regulation is conceived as an inherent part of the defence of the realm. At the level of the regulators themselves, innovation in regulatory cooperation has drawn on existing collegiate and concurrency models. In the end, and I think the whole of the discussion so far pushes us in concluding this, the acid test will be the demonstrable efficacy or not of platform regulation in the UK. Its scope will be defined by imminent new legislation regarding online safety and also digital competition, and then all the filling in of the bits in between. Thank you.
Thanks, Philip. So I think we are running quite low on time, so I am going to skip my presentation, but there are two things I did want to raise. And I think when we talk about transparency, we've looked at copyright considerations, creativity, and Philip mentions quite rightly that a lot of the overarching rhetoric is that of pro-competition and pro-innovation, regardless of the regulatory framework or the jurisdiction we're in. And I think we are facing a massive challenge in any jurisdiction in the UK, the US, the EU, in South Korea, where they're regulating digital platforms, in Brazil, that we actually have two transparency problems. So we have transparency obligations, and they range from pro-competition obligations to copyright protection and so on. So as Martin said, opening the black box and seeing how decisions are being made. We have a more fundamental problem, I think, which is the transparency of the regime. And we currently are facing massive challenges because the regulatory regime in the EU with the DMA is not coherent nor transparent as to the goals that are being pursued. We often talk about the DMA as being about contestability and fairness, but actually the DMA says it multiple times that each obligation in the list of obligations has a very specific objective of its own, and that the effectiveness of the DMA will be assessed based on whether those objectives of those obligations are being satisfied. but we have no guidance and no understanding on how that works. Even worse in the UK, where it's not even clear to what extent the objectives or principles of the code of conduct are going to be established in statute, and to what extent we're going to be able to measure their effectiveness. I think transparency is one of the key problems we're facing right now in any jurisdiction, both because there are transparency obligations and it's not clear what harm they're trying to remedy, and also because there's no real coherence in how we're regulating. Philip pointed out that what we're saying to the public, you're going to be safe online, you won't have harmful content, is not what we're doing behind the scenes. And I think that's worth mentioning. But I think those are discussions we can have in multiple panels and multiple conferences going in the future. And I look forward to create an IBCI talking about these things in the future. So I think there's lots to be discussed here and loads of different angles. And Vinicius, you wanted to come in, didn't you?
I want to thank you everyone from Kuwait for this amazing panel in the name of the IBCI, and I want to say that must be a kickoff for a long partnership, because the panel was very good and I have no time to do these discussions, but this panel showed us a lot of questions, a lot of important insights and approaches that are important to UK, but also Brazil, because we are starting to regulate now in Brazil. And it's very important for us to have these discussions and continue this partnership. So thank you very much, everyone had spoken, and thank you, Create, for this opportunity.
Maybe you should make it official and invite us to fly to Brazil, Vinicius. We will all come willingly, I am sure. So we don't have much time left, but I guess we have time for one question. If there is a question either on YouTube or from one of the panelists themselves. So Vinicius, you are checking the questions, right? Did you get any YouTube questions?
No YouTube questions. We can.
Any last words from any of the panelists? Otherwise, I think we will continue and look at the other panels in the conference.
Yeah, thank you for facilitating it, Magali, and I thought it was very fruitful. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
And see you later, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.